It was one of those late nights, the kind where you're not really doing anything but letting the hours slip by without much thought. I had long since grown tired of the usual routine: work, rest, eat, repeat. There was a sense of monotony that hung over me like a thick fog, one that I couldn't quite shake off. I craved something new, something that would pull me out of the haze and remind me what it felt like to feel alive again. That's when I stumbled upon it. I was scrolling through my audiobook app, half-heartedly searching for something interesting to distract myself. The usual recommendations, mystery novels, self-help books, and romance stories, didn't catch my attention. My mind was too restless for something so familiar. But then the title popped up on my screen: The Vampire System. I had seen it before in passing but never gave it much thought. Vampires? Again? Seemed like a genre overdone, a tired trope that had long since run its course. I almost skipped it, but something about the name intrigued me. The word system stood out to me. It wasn't just vampires in some gothic setting, there was something more to it. Maybe it wasn't just a supernatural story after all. I clicked on the book, not expecting much, but hoping for at least a small spark to ignite my imagination. From the very first chapter, I knew this wasn't going to be like any other vampire story I had encountered before. The narrator's voice drew me in immediately. It wasn't just an audiobook. It was a journey into a world so intricately woven that I could almost see it unfolding in front of my eyes. The world of the vampire system was built on complex laws, rules, and forces beyond what I could have imagined. It wasn't about the bloodthirsty creatures lurking in the shadows. It was about the system itself, the forces that controlled not just the vampires but the lives of everyone caught in its web. In this world, vampires weren't just creatures of myth or fantasy. They were part of a larger system, an intricate structure where power, control, and survival were dictated by an age-old hierarchy. The system wasn't just a backdrop to the story, it was a character in itself. It was something that shaped every decision, every relationship, every moment in the story. And just like that, I was hooked. As the first few chapters unfolded, I was introduced to the characters, each one more complex than the last. First, they seemed like typical characters you would expect in a vampire story: the brooding, mysterious vampire lord, the fierce warrior, the reluctant hero. But as the narrative dug deeper, I realized they were much more than just their roles. They were people, lost, broken, and trying to navigate a world that seemed intent on crushing them under its weight. They were struggling with their place within the system, torn between duty, loyalty, and their own desires. I found myself relating to these characters in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about their supernatural abilities or their struggles with the vampire world. It was about the things that made them human. The vampire system was a metaphor for the systems we all find ourselves in, whether it's societal pressures, career expectations, or family dynamics. I couldn't help but wonder, how much of my own life was dictated by forces beyond my control? How many times had I let the systems around me determine my actions, my choices, my future? The more I listened, the more the themes of power and control resonated with me. The vampires in the story had power, yes, but it wasn't the kind of power you could easily wield. It was a power that came with rules, rigid and unforgiving. They were trapped within a system that rewarded the ruthless, punished the weak, and left little room for those who didn't play by the rules. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how similar this was to the world I lived in. We all play in systems, whether we like it or not. We live within frameworks, be it professional, social, or familial, that shape our decisions and limit our choices. But then there was the element of choice. I had never really considered the concept of choice in a system. The characters in the vampire system weren't entirely powerless. Despite the constraints placed upon them, they still had the ability to choose. Sure, it wasn't always easy, and the consequences were often severe, but they had a say in how they navigated the world. It was this idea that began to seep into my own thoughts, slowly changing the way I viewed my own life. If these vampires could break free from their systems and find their own path, could I do the same? Could I challenge the systems I was a part of and carve out my own space? The first few chapters were only the beginning, but they were enough to plant a seed in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept listening, one chapter after the next, unable to pull myself away from this world that was far more than just fantasy. It was a mirror, reflecting back the struggles I had faced in my own life, the battles with identity, with power, with love. But more importantly, it was showing me a way forward. And just like that, the vampire system wasn't just an audiobook anymore. It was a lens through which I began to see my own life, my own struggles, in a completely different light. As I delved deeper into the story, it wasn't long before I began to identify with the characters on a much more personal level. What initially started as a curiosity about the vampire world had quickly transformed into a profound exploration of self. Characters in the vampire system weren't just figments of fantasy. They were reflections of real human struggles, struggles that mirrored my own. The first character that truly resonated with me was Raylen, the protagonist. Raylen wasn't your typical hero. He wasn't born into greatness, nor did he possess overwhelming strength or supernatural charisma. In fact, he was an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit into the rigid structures of the vampire world. He was initially weak, unimportant, and overlooked. Yet, as the story progressed, Raylen began to discover the true power within him. Not physical power, but the power of choice and will. Raylen's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about finding his place in a world that had already set rules in stone for him. Much like many of us, Raylen was forced to navigate a world that didn't always welcome him, where his decisions weren't entirely his own but dictated by an invisible force, the vampire system. I began to see parts of myself in him. How many times had I felt out of place in the systems I was part of? How often had I been forced to follow rules set by others simply because it was the only path available? But Raylen was different. He chose to rebel against the system, to carve out his own path, even though it wasn't easy. Watching him struggle with the consequences of his actions was eye-opening for me. His choices weren't always the right ones, and sometimes they led to pain, but they were his choices. I realized then that it wasn't always about the outcomes, but about taking ownership of your decisions. Raylen's struggle with identity struck a chord with me as well. He had been born into a system that defined who he was supposed to be. His worth was measured by his abilities, by what he could do within the confines of this ancient, oppressive system. First, he tried to fit into the mold, to accept that his destiny had already been written. But as the series unfolded, he began to question everything. Who was he, really? Was he just a product of his circumstances, or could he shape his own identity? In the beginning, I didn't realize how much Raylen's story would influence my own journey of self-discovery. Like him, I had spent a large part of my life trying to fit into the molds that others had set for me, whether it was expectations from family, society, or the professional world. I had let the systems around me define who I was supposed to be. But as I listened to Raylen's internal conflict, I started to wonder, could I reshape my own identity too? Could I break free from the labels that had been imposed upon me? Raylen's transformation didn't happen overnight. He faced obstacles at every turn. The vampire system constantly tested his resolve, forcing him to question his worth, his goals, and his values. But what made him so compelling was his resilience. He didn't always know what was best for him, but he kept going. He made mistakes, lost battles, and hurt people along the way, but he never gave up. This was the lesson I needed to learn. For the first time in a long time, I began to see failure in a new light. Failure wasn't the end, it was just another step in the process of growth. Raylen didn't let his mistakes define him. Instead, he used them as stepping stones to better understand himself and the world around him. His journey was messy, imperfect, and raw, but it was real. It reminded me that my own struggles weren't something to be ashamed of. They were part of what made me who I was. But Raylen wasn't the only character who left a lasting impression on me. There was Leandra, a fierce and independent vampire warrior. Leandra was everything I wasn't, confident, decisive, and unapologetically herself. She was part of the system, yes, but she had learned to manipulate it to her advantage. While Raylan struggled with his identity, Leandra had fully embraced hers. She had taken the power the system offered her and used it to carve out a space for herself in the world. She was someone who had come to terms with her power and wasn't afraid to wield it, no matter the consequences. First, I was intimidated by Leandra. Her strength and confidence were qualities I admired but didn't know how to embody myself. However, as the series went on, I began to see her in a different light. Leandra wasn't just strong because of her abilities, she was strong because she had chosen to be. She had taken control of her life, and in doing so, she had redefined what it meant to be powerful. Through Leandra, I began to question my own relationship with power. I had always seen power as something external, something that others had over me. But Leandra taught me that power wasn't just about control over others, it was about control over yourself. It was about knowing who you are, what you stand for, and refusing to let the world dictate your path. Leandra's character made me realize that I didn't have to be a victim of the systems around me. Like her, I could choose to take control and make my own decisions. And then there was Dax, a brooding antihero who found himself caught between the systems of the vampire world and his desire for something more. Dax was the character who made me reflect on the true meaning of sacrifice. He was willing to give up everything, his power, his love, and even his life, to protect those he cared about. Dax's journey forced me to examine the concept of love and sacrifice in a way I hadn't before. In a world defined by power struggles, his devotion to others reminded me of the importance of putting others first, even at great personal cost. As I listened to these characters' stories, I found myself reflecting on my own choices and relationships. I began to ask myself, what sacrifices had I made for the people I loved? How much was I willing to give for them? Dax's selflessness made me realize that love, true love, wasn't about possession or control, it was about selfless giving. It was about understanding that sometimes the greatest power you can wield is the power to sacrifice for those who matter most. As the story of the vampire system unfolded, one theme began to dominate my thoughts: identity. It became clear that the series wasn't just about survival in a brutal world of vampires and power struggles. It was about the characters' quests for self-discovery. Each of them, in their own way, was wrestling with the question, who am I really? This theme was most prominent in Raylan's journey. His struggle with identity wasn't something I could easily shake off. Early in the story, Raylan was thrust into a world that demanded he conform to its strict rules. He was expected to play a role, to follow the path laid out before him by the ancient vampire system. His worth was determined by his abilities, his bloodline, and his place in the hierarchy. It was a world that left little room for personal expression. Everything about Raylan's life, from his relationships to his career, was dictated by the system. First, Raylan accepted his place within the system. He believed he had no choice but to comply, to become what was expected of him. But as the story progressed, he began to question this. Raylan realized that his identity was not just about fulfilling expectations. It wasn't about fitting into the box that others had drawn for him. It was about discovering who he truly was beneath the labels and rules imposed on him. It was this internal battle that struck a chord with me. For years, I had defined myself based on what others expected of me. Whether it was my family, friends, or career, I had always felt pressure to fit into the mold that others had created. Like Raylan, I often believed that I had no choice but to play the role assigned to me. But as I listened to Raylan's journey, I began to question that belief. Could I change? Could I redefine myself outside of the systems that controlled my life? The moment that truly shifted my perspective came when Raylan made the conscious decision to embrace his own identity, to stop letting the system define who he was. He chose to step outside of the roles that had been forced upon him and, for the first time, take ownership of who he wanted to be. It was a turning point not just in the story but in my own life. Raylan's decision made me realize that we all have the power to reshape our identities, to let go of the labels and expectations that others place on us. I had spent so much of my life defining myself by the systems around me, whether it was my job, my family, or society at large. I had let these external forces shape my sense of self. But Raylan's transformation made me see that I didn't have to live that way. I could choose who I wanted to be, regardless of the expectations others had for me. And it wasn't just Raylan who went through this transformation. Other characters like Leandra and Dax also grappled with their identities. Leandra, the strong and independent vampire warrior, had already embraced her sense of self. She knew who she was, and she wasn't afraid to live her truth, even if it meant defying the system. Her confidence was something I admired, but it was also something I wanted to develop for myself. Leandra wasn't afraid to take control of her own destiny, and that was something I began to long for in my own life. Then there was Dax, whose internal conflict was more subtle but equally important. Dax's journey was one of self-acceptance. He didn't fit neatly into the mold of the vampire warrior or the villain. He was somewhere in between, constantly questioning his purpose and his role within the system. His story made me realize that identity isn't always clear-cut. Sometimes it's about accepting the parts of yourself that don't fit into society's definitions. Dax showed me that embracing the complexity of who you are, without feeling the need to conform, is just as important as discovering who you want to be. The more I reflected on these characters and their journeys, the more I began to question my own sense of self. For years, I had been afraid to embrace certain parts of who I was. I had let the expectations of others limit my sense of identity. But the characters in the vampire system showed me that there was power in embracing all of who I was, even the parts one had kept hidden. Through them, I realized that identity is not static. It's not something that is given to us by the systems we belong to, nor is it something that we simply inherit. It is a journey, a process of constant self-discovery. It's about shedding the roles that others assign to us and finding the courage to step into the person we were meant to be. Identity is not found in conformity. It is found in choice and self-expression. This realization was life-changing for me. It inspired me to begin questioning the systems that had shaped my life and the way I saw myself. I didn't want to be defined by other people's expectations anymore. I wanted to take ownership of my identity and make choices that reflected the person I truly was, not the person others thought I should be. It wasn't an easy journey, and I'm still on it. There are moments when I fall back into old patterns, when I feel the weight of societal expectations pressing down on me. But now, whenever I catch myself slipping into those old ways of thinking, I remind myself of Raylan, Leandra, and Dax, and the lessons they taught me about identity and self-discovery. Their stories are a constant reminder that we are not defined by the systems around us. We are defined by the choices we make, the actions we take, and the courage we have to embrace who we really are. As Raylan's journey through the complex vampire system deepened, I found myself increasingly drawn to another powerful theme within the series: the dynamics of power and control. The vampire system wasn't just about supernatural creatures, it was about the forces that shape individuals and societies. It was about understanding the ways in which power operates and how it can either trap us or free us. Raylan's struggle with power was something that became painfully clear to me as the story progressed. Initially, power seemed like something he had to achieve, something that would give him control over his own fate. As he advanced in his journey, he came to understand that power wasn't always the solution. It was, in many ways, part of the problem. First, Raylan viewed power as a means of liberation. He believed that if he could just gain enough strength, enough influence, he would finally be able to control his own life. The more he fought against the system, the more he realized that power, when wielded without understanding, could easily become a trap. It wasn't just about obtaining power, it was about what you did with it, how you used it, and how the very system that promised freedom through power could just as easily enslave you. This idea of power, and its inherent dangers, made me think deeply about my own relationship with it. Growing up, I had always been taught that power was the key to freedom. Whether it was in school, at work, or within my family, there was always the underlying message that the more you achieved, the more you could control. The more power you had, the more choices you could make. But Raylan's experience in the vampire system forced me to challenge this idea. Raylan's internal struggle became one of the most compelling parts of the series. As he moved deeper into the vampire world, gaining more strength, more influence, he began to notice how those in power didn't have the freedom they promised themselves. Instead, they were bound by a set of rules, laws, and expectations that restricted their ability to make choices. The higher you climbed, the more isolated you became from your own humanity. The more power you gained, the more control the system had over you. At one point in the story, Raylan has an epiphany. He realizes that, despite his rising power, he's still trapped within the confines of the same system that dictated his every move. The idea of freedom through power was an illusion. The very system that offered power as a reward was the same system that limited his true freedom. This realization was life-changing for me. It was a wake-up call that made me question my own views on power. I had always equated power with freedom, assuming that if I could just gain enough influence, enough control, my life would be my own. But Raylan's story forced me to confront the possibility that power, in the way I had always understood it, might be nothing more than an illusion. I began to reflect on the times in my life when I had sought power. In my career, in my relationships, I had always believed that gaining more control would allow me to dictate my own destiny. But as I looked back, I saw how the pursuit of power had sometimes led me to make choices that didn't truly serve me. I had allowed myself to be controlled by the systems around me, chasing a form of freedom that was ultimately restrictive. Raylan's story showed me that true freedom wasn't about power at all. It wasn't about control or influence. True freedom was about choice. It was about the ability to decide on your own terms how you would live, what you would value, and how you would navigate the world around you. But this wasn't something Raylan learned overnight. The deeper he got into the system, the more he realized that power wasn't just something to be desired, it was something to be understood. And understanding power meant realizing that it isn't about control over others, but control over yourself. It was about being at peace with who you are, regardless of the external pressures that sought to dictate your actions. In many ways, the vampire system was a cautionary tale about the dangers of power without self-awareness. It illustrated how the pursuit of power could consume you if you didn't understand its true nature. And it was in Raylan's slow realization that power wasn't the ultimate solution that I found my own awakening. I began to understand that the more I tried to control my circumstances, the more I actually allowed the systems around me to control me. This shift in perspective was monumental. I started to ask myself different questions. Rather than thinking about what I could control, I began to wonder what I was willing to let go of. I realized that the pursuit of power might not be the key to true freedom after all. Instead, true freedom came from within, from the ability to let go of the need to control everything and trust that, by aligning with my authentic self, I would find my path. There was another character in the story, Leandra, who exemplified this shift in thinking. Leandra, despite her confidence and strength, never sought power for the sake of control. She already had immense power, yet she wielded it with wisdom and purpose. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, and her actions showed me that power was best used when you had the ability to choose how it impacted those around you, not as a tool for domination. Leandra's approach to power was a stark contrast to Raylan's initial view. She didn't seek to conquer the system. Instead, she worked within it, understanding its limitations and using her influence to shape her path, rather than letting it dictate her every move. The more I thought about these characters, the more I realized how power dynamics played a role in every aspect of our lives. We are all part of systems, social, professional, familial, that exert power over us in different ways. The question wasn't about gaining more control, it was about understanding the systems we're in and choosing how we want to relate to them. Power was not about domination, it was about awareness and choice. As Raylan's journey through the complex web of the vampire system progressed, one theme stood out to me more than any other: the meaning of love and sacrifice. While the story was full of action, betrayal, and power struggles, it was the characters' emotional journeys, particularly the sacrifices they made for those they loved, that left the most lasting impression on me. The heart of the vampire system was the notion that love wasn't just an abstract feeling. It wasn't just something to be desired or cherished. Love, in the context of the story, was something that had the potential to change everything. It was the driving force behind some of the most difficult decisions the characters had to make, and it was intertwined with the theme of sacrifice in a way that made me reflect on the very nature of these two emotions in my own life. Raylan's love for those close to him was a central part of his character arc. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for those he loved. His sacrifices were not always obvious, and at times they felt like burdens he didn't want to bear. But each decision he made, each moment when he put the needs of others before his own, pushed him further along the path of self-discovery. Raylan's love for his family, his friends, and even the people he barely knew became the driving force behind his transformation. It was a particularly poignant moment when Raylan realized that his love for others was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. Love made him vulnerable, made him capable of great acts of heroism, but it also led him to make decisions that would cost him dearly. In the face of overwhelming power and danger, Raylan was willing to risk everything, not just for survival but for the people he loved. And it was this willingness to sacrifice for others that ultimately defined his character. I had never truly understood the depth of sacrifice until I saw it through Raylan's eyes. Love in this world was not something easy or convenient. It wasn't about fleeting romantic gestures or simple declarations of affection. It was about making the hardest choices, the ones that could tear you apart inside because you knew that the people you loved were worth it. This was a concept I had often overlooked in my own life. I had always thought of love in terms of what it could give me, companionship, support, comfort, but the vampire system taught me that love was just as much about what you were willing to give. Raylan didn't just love others, he sacrificed for them. Whether it was his time, his safety, or his own desires, Raylan was willing to give up parts of himself for the sake of those he cared about. I found myself reflecting on my own relationships and the sacrifices I had, or hadn't, made for the people I loved. Love was something I had always believed in, but I had never truly understood the depth of its implications. It wasn't just about caring for someone, it was about being willing to lose something for them. Real love wasn't about holding on to what you had, it was about letting go, about giving without expecting anything in return. One of the most powerful examples of sacrifice in the series came from Dax, the character who was constantly caught between his desire for power and his commitment to those he loved. Dax had the potential to become a leader within the vampire system, but what held him back was his unshakable devotion to those close to him. He could have taken power for himself, could have used his strength to dominate, but instead, he chose to protect his people, even when it meant personal loss. Dax's love for his friends and family led him to make sacrifices that ultimately shaped his destiny. He didn't have the luxury of selfishness. Every decision he made had far-reaching consequences. And yet, he chose to bear the weight of those consequences because his love for others was more important than his own desires. His sacrifice wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and spiritual. Dax's journey made me realize that love isn't just about giving in the moment, it's about the long-term commitment to another person's well-being, even when it costs you. It was about choosing someone else's happiness over your own, and that was something I had never fully considered before. Then there was Leandra, whose love was intertwined with a sense of duty and honor. Leandra's character represented a different kind of love, the love of loyalty, of duty, and of responsibility. Her sacrifices were not for the sake of a single person, but for the greater good. She gave up personal happiness and peace to ensure the survival of her people and the stability of the vampire world. Her love wasn't just for her family or friends, it was for something greater than herself. Leandra's sacrifice made me think about the role of duty in love. Sometimes, love wasn't about what you felt in the moment, it was about making difficult choices for the sake of the larger picture. Her sense of responsibility pushed her to sacrifice her own desires for the greater good. While Raylan's love was personal and intimate, Leandra's was selfless and wide-reaching, reminding me that love could also be about the greater good, about doing what's right even when it's not easy. The emotional weight of sacrifice was something I had always taken for granted. I had never truly considered what it meant to give up parts of myself for the sake of others, nor had I fully understood the complexities of loving without expecting something in return. But as I listened to Raylan, Dax, and Leandra's stories, I began to realize that love and sacrifice were inseparable. Love was not something that could be easily defined. It was not always romantic or simple. Sometimes it was painful and filled with difficult choices. But it was also the thing that gave us purpose, that gave us strength in the face of adversity. And sacrifice? Sacrifice was the price we paid for that love, for the connections we made, and for the people we cared about. As I reflected on these themes, I realized that I, too, had the opportunity to love more deeply, more selflessly. I could look at my relationships not through the lens of what I could gain, but through what I was willing to give. And in doing so, I could learn to embrace the true meaning of sacrifice, not as a burden, but as a privilege. By the time I reached the later chapters of the vampire system, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about life. The series had already made me reconsider my views on power, control, love, and sacrifice, but it was the final arc that truly pushed me to confront my own beliefs in ways I hadn't anticipated. The series wasn't just an escape into a world of fantasy. It was a powerful exploration of self, one that challenged the very core of who I was and how I viewed the world. As Raylan's story reached its climax, he found himself facing the greatest challenge of all, the choice between accepting the world as it was or trying to reshape it. The vampire system, with all its power and history, was a system built on centuries of tradition, oppression, and control. Raylan had already defied much of the system's rules, but now he was faced with a decision that could change the very fabric of reality. His choices weren't just about survival anymore, they were about revolution. Raylan's struggle made me reflect on the systems I was part of in my own life. Much like the vampire system, the world I lived in had its own set of rules, rules that I had long accepted without question. Whether it was the professional world, societal expectations, or family pressures, there were systems in place that shaped my decisions. But Raylan's journey made me ask, what if those systems were flawed? What if the world I had accepted was broken? The more I listened to Raylan's internal battle, the more I realized that I, too, had accepted systems without questioning them. I had grown accustomed to the idea that some things were beyond my control, that certain forces, be they societal, cultural, or professional, were simply how things were meant to be. Like Raylan, I had allowed myself to become complacent within the systems I inhabited. But Raylan didn't accept things as they were. He pushed against the boundaries of the system, determined to create a new path, a path that was not bound by tradition or history. His rebellion wasn't just an act of defiance, it was an act of transformation. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for a world where everyone had the freedom to shape their own destiny. Raylan's transformation made me realize something profound. Change is possible, but it requires the courage to challenge the status quo. It's easy to fall into the trap of accepting the world around us as fixed, to believe that the way things are is the way they will always be. But the truth is, every system, every belief can be questioned, challenged, and if necessary, transformed. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. The idea that we have the power to reshape the world around us, and by extension ourselves, was empowering. But it also came with the weight of responsibility. If I were to challenge the systems in my life, what would I lose? What would I have to give up? Would I have the strength to see it through? Raylan's journey gave me the courage to face these questions head-on. It made me realize that I had been living too passively, accepting the limitations placed upon me by the systems around me. I had never questioned them, I had simply lived within their confines. But now, as I listened to Raylan's internal monologue about the need for change, I realized that I, too, had the ability to break free from these limitations. It wasn't just about rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It was about recognizing when something no longer served you and finding the strength to change it. Whether it was my career, my personal life, or the way I saw myself, I had to confront the parts of my life that were being shaped by external forces. Was I living my truth, or was I simply conforming to the expectations of the world around me? The series made me confront these questions with a new perspective. I realized that we are often imprisoned by our own beliefs, by the systems we've internalized. We believe we are bound by them, that we have no choice but to live within the confines they create. But Raylan's journey showed me that the only thing standing between us and the change we seek is our own willingness to challenge those beliefs, to break free from the shackles that hold us back. It wasn't just Raylan who went through this transformation. Throughout the series, I watched as other characters, like Leandra and Dax, also confronted their own perspectives. Leandra, the strong-willed warrior, had already taken steps to reshape her life. But even she, with all her power and confidence, had to learn to question her own motivations. Dax, on the other hand, had to confront the dark side of his past and the beliefs that had shaped his actions. Both characters were forced to re-examine their own lives, to challenge the systems they had once accepted as truth. What I realized from their stories was that personal growth is not just about embracing new truths, it's about letting go of the old ones. It's about being willing to change the way we see ourselves, the way we view the world, and the way we engage with the systems that surround us. It's about having the courage to say, "This no longer serves me," and then taking the necessary steps to transform it. This was the turning point in my own journey. Like Raylan, I had to ask myself, what was I willing to challenge in my life? What systems had I been blindly following? And, more importantly, how could I begin to reshape them to better reflect who I truly was? Raylan's story, filled with action and drama, wasn't just an escape for me, it was a wake-up call. Forced me to confront my own passive acceptance of the systems around me and made me realize that change is possible, but it requires conscious effort and the courage to question everything you've been taught. As I moved forward in my own life, I knew that I had to start taking action. I couldn't wait for the world to change around me. I had to be the one to initiate that change, to take the first step toward creating a life that reflected my true values, my true beliefs. The systems I had been a part of were not fixed. They were malleable, just like me. And with that, I set my intentions to challenge the systems around me, to break free from the limiting beliefs I had been holding on to, and to shape my future according to my own terms. As I continued to immerse myself in the vampire system, I began to notice that it wasn't just the big moments, the battles, the betrayals, and the climactic revelations that made the story impactful. It was the quiet moments, the struggles, the internal battles the characters faced, and the lessons they learned along the way. These moments of growth became the foundation of the series, offering deeper insights into who the characters were and, by extension, who I was becoming. Each character in the series, Raylan, Leandra, Dax, and even those on the periphery, faced challenges that tested their resolve. But what fascinated me was how they each reacted to these challenges. The decisions they made weren't always clear-cut, nor were they always the right decisions. But in the end, each of their struggles led to growth, to a deeper understanding of themselves and the world around them. Raylan's journey, in particular, stood as a stark reminder that personal growth doesn't happen without sacrifice, discomfort, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. As Raylan grew stronger, both mentally and emotionally, he learned that power wasn't just about fighting battles. It was about having the strength to overcome your own fears, insecurities, and self-doubt. One of the most significant lessons I took away from Raylan's character was the idea that growth requires discomfort. Raylan, despite all his strength and resilience, was never fully at peace with himself. He constantly struggled with his identity, his purpose, and the consequences of his actions. But it was in this struggle, this constant battle with his inner demons, that Raylan found his true power. His story taught me that growth isn't linear. It isn't something that comes easily or quickly. Sometimes it feels like you're moving backwards or that you'll never reach the place you want to be. But it's during these moments of doubt, during the moments when you question your path, that you're actually making the most progress. Growth isn't about perfection, it's about persistence, self-reflection, and the courage to continue even when things seem impossible. Raylan's ability to push through his doubts and face his deepest fears made me realize that the greatest challenge we often face in our own lives is not the external world, but the internal world. The voices of self-doubt, the fear of failure, and the temptation to give up are the true adversaries we must overcome. Raylan didn't become who he was because he fought and won every battle. He became who he was because he faced those battles and learned from them. Leandra, too, had her own lessons to teach. Her path was marked by strength, but also by a deep sense of sacrifice. Leandra was a character who initially appeared invincible, strong-willed, independent, and capable of standing against anyone who threatened her. But as her character unfolded, it became clear that her strength wasn't just in her physical abilities. Her true strength came from her ability to balance power with compassion, to make tough decisions, and to carry the weight of responsibility even when it felt unbearable. Leandra's greatest lesson was about the importance of balance. Power without compassion becomes tyranny. Strength without understanding becomes cruelty. She showed me that true leadership, true strength, comes not from domination but from the ability to care for others. Leandra often had to make sacrifices. She had to give up parts of herself, her happiness, and sometimes even her safety, for the greater good. But through it all, she never lost sight of her core values: loyalty, honor, and the belief in doing what was right. Watching Leandra's journey made me realize that there are moments in life when we must choose between what's easy and what's right. Choosing what's right is often the harder path, but it's the one that leads to true fulfillment. It's the path that requires us to sacrifice our immediate desires for a greater cause. Leandra's lessons about responsibility and accountability resonated deeply with me. It reminded me that leadership, whether in my career, personal life, or even within myself, was not just about taking control. It was about guiding with integrity and making the hard decisions that would benefit not just myself but those around me. Dax, on the other hand, taught me about redemption and the ability to change. Dax was the kind of character who had made mistakes, who had walked a dark path and often struggled with the consequences of his past actions. Yet his story was one of growth and forgiveness. He showed me that it's never too late to change. It doesn't matter how far down the wrong path you've gone, you always have the power to choose a different direction. What struck me most about Dax's character was his ability to acknowledge his flaws, face them head-on, and work towards becoming a better version of himself. So often in life we are told that we must be perfect, that we must have everything figured out. But Dax's journey reminded me that imperfection is human, and it's through our imperfections that we find our greatest capacity for growth. Dax's story was about redemption, not just from others but from ourselves. He made me realize that forgiving yourself is just as important as forgiving others. Too often we hold on to guilt, shame, and regret, believing that they define who we are. But Dax's ability to move forward, to learn from his mistakes and make better choices, gave me a new perspective on what it means to truly heal. Through these character struggles, I began to see the underlying truth that the lessons we learn in life often come not from our successes but from our failures. It's through the mistakes, the pain, and the moments of self-doubt that we come to understand who we truly are and what we are capable of. Each character's growth in the vampire system served as a mirror for me, reflecting my own journey and reminding me that growth is often born from hardship. I learned from Raylan that discomfort is the birthplace of change. I learned from Leandra that strength without compassion is incomplete, and that responsibility requires self-awareness and sacrifice. And from Dax, I learned that no matter how far we've fallen, we always have the power to rise again, to redeem ourselves, and to change our own narrative. As I neared the end of the vampire system, I found myself reflecting on everything the series had taught me. Raylan, Leandra, Dax, and the rest of the characters had become more than just fictional beings. They had become mirrors, reflecting the parts of myself that I had never truly examined. They had forced me to question my beliefs, confront my fears, and challenge the systems that had long shaped my life. And as I reached the final chapters, I realized that the impact of this story would stay with me long after the audiobook ended. The final arc of the story was a culmination of everything Raylan had learned. He had spent so much of his life fighting against the system, trying to change the world that had imprisoned him. But in the end, he realized that true change didn't come from defeating the system. It came from understanding it, from accepting that no system is perfect, and from working within it to create something better. It wasn't about breaking free from the system entirely, but about finding a way to navigate it in a way that aligned with his values. This was a powerful lesson for me. Like Raylan, I had spent much of my life fighting against the systems around me, trying to break free from the constraints that I felt held me back. I had often believed that the only way to find true freedom was to escape the systems that controlled me. But as Raylan's journey unfolded, I realized that it wasn't about running away from the system. It was about learning to work within it, to understand its rules and structure, and to find ways to transform it from the inside out. This realization changed the way I saw my own life. I had always viewed my career, my personal life, and my relationships as systems I had to either conform to or rebel against. But the more I reflected on the story, the more I understood that the systems we live in, whether they are social, professional, or even personal, are never going to be perfect. They are always going to have flaws, weaknesses, and contradictions. Key is not to destroy them, but to navigate them with awareness, to find ways to adapt and evolve within them without losing who you are in the process. One of the most profound aspects of the vampire system was its ability to show that change is a process. It isn't something that happens overnight, nor is it something that can be forced. Change takes time, patience, and most importantly, awareness. Raylan's transformation wasn't immediate. He struggled, he failed, and he made mistakes. But in the end, it was his persistence, his willingness to keep going even when it seemed impossible, that allowed him to evolve. This was another lesson that resonated deeply with me. So often, I had been impatient with myself, expecting quick results or immediate transformations. I had wanted to make changes in my life, but I had failed to realize that true change takes time. It's a gradual process, one that requires constant reflection and adaptation. Raylan's journey showed me that progress doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to be consistent. It's the small, everyday choices that shape who we become, and the willingness to keep moving forward, even when things don't go according to plan, that ultimately leads to growth. As the series came to a close, I found myself reflecting on the enduring impact it had on me. The vampire system had done more than entertain me. It had forced me to confront my own beliefs, my own fears, and my own limitations. It had pushed me to question everything, from the systems I operated within to the choices I made every day. And perhaps most importantly, it had made me realize that true power doesn't come from external forces, it comes from within. Raylan, Leandra, and Dax had taught me that power is not about control. It's about the ability to make choices. It's about owning your decisions, embracing your flaws, and learning from your mistakes. And it's about never giving up on yourself, even when the world around you seems determined to push you down. The final chapters of the series left me with a sense of peace, a sense that the lessons Raylan learned and the struggles he faced were not just his to bear. They were lessons I could apply to my own life. The journey of self-discovery, of finding one's place in the world, of challenging the systems that try to control us, it wasn't just a story. It was a reflection of the journey we all go through in our own way. As I closed the audiobook for the final time, I knew that the vampire system had left a permanent mark on me. The lessons it imparted, about power, control, sacrifice, love, and identity, had reshaped the way I viewed the world and my place in it. And while the story had ended, the impact it had on me was just beginning. I realized that I didn't need to wait for external circumstances to change. I had the power to change my own system, my own path, my own future. And just like Raylan, Leandra, and Dax, I too had the power to choose how I navigated the challenges that lay ahead. The vampire system had shown me that change is inevitable, but growth is a choice. As the days passed since I finished the vampire system, I realized just how deeply the series had embedded itself in my thoughts. It wasn't just the characters, the plot twists, or even the epic battles that had left an impression on me. It was the way the series had made me rethink everything I knew about myself, the world, and how I interacted with both. The lessons, both big and small, lingered in my mind, shaping the way I approached challenges, relationships, and even the simplest decisions in my life. The most profound shift I experienced was a deeper understanding of how systems, whether personal or societal, operate in our lives. Before listening to the series, I had often seen the world in binary terms. Either I was fighting against something or simply submitting to it. Characters, particularly Raylan, taught me that the answer wasn't as simple as rebellion or acceptance. Key was finding a way to work within the system without losing yourself, to navigate it with self-awareness and purpose, and to ultimately use it as a stepping stone for personal growth. I began to look at my own life differently. Pressures I had felt from my job, from my relationships, from societal expectations no longer seemed so oppressive. The lesson I learned from Raylan was simple yet powerful. I didn't have to fight everything I encountered. I didn't have to be constantly at war with the world. Instead, I could choose how I engaged with it. I could take what worked for me and discard what didn't. I could navigate the systems I was part of with intention, carving out a space for myself that reflected my true values. It was a realization that changed everything. As I reflected on Leandra's journey, I understood that leadership isn't about control, it's about service. The greatest leaders don't demand loyalty, they earn it by making choices that serve others and promote growth. Leandra's ability to lead with compassion and strength showed me that leadership is rooted in responsibility. The responsibility to those you lead, the responsibility to uphold integrity, and the responsibility to make decisions with the greater good in mind. In my own life, I began to see the importance of serving those around me, whether in my career, with my family, or in my friendships. It wasn't about being in charge, it was about being accountable to others, about putting their needs above your own when necessary, and about using your power to help elevate those around you. Leandra had a sense of purpose that was about far more than just self-interest. It was about understanding that leadership in any form requires a deep commitment to others. Dax's story had left me with a lasting reflection on forgiveness and redemption. I had always struggled with the idea of forgiving myself for past mistakes. I held on to guilt and shame, believing that these emotions somehow made me a better person. But Dax's transformation made me realize that holding on to regret wasn't a form of moral superiority, it was a barrier to growth. Dax forgave himself, and in doing so, he freed himself to evolve into someone better. His story made me realize that it's not about erasing the past, it's about learning from it and moving forward. I began to see that holding on to past mistakes didn't make me stronger, it only weighed me down. Letting go of that guilt was the first step toward true healing. Just like Dax, I could take responsibility for my actions, make amends where possible, and then choose to move forward with a clean slate. As I applied these lessons to my own life, I noticed subtle but significant changes. My relationships grew stronger as I learned to lead with more compassion, less ego. I found myself making decisions not just for myself but for the benefit of others, recognizing that true success isn't about winning, it's about growing together. I started to view challenges not as obstacles to overcome but as opportunities for growth, for understanding myself and the world better. The internal battles that Raylan, Leandra, and Dax faced were no longer just fictional struggles. They were a reflection of the very battles I fought daily in my own life. The vampire system at its core wasn't just a story about vampires and power, it was a story about human resilience, about the constant struggle for identity, purpose, and belonging. It was a reflection of how we all navigate the complexities of the systems we are part of, how we all must make choices that define who we are and who we will become. Raylan's story taught me that we all have the power to change, to transform not just ourselves but the systems we are part of. Leandra's journey showed me that true strength comes from the ability to serve others, to lead with integrity and compassion. Dax's redemption reminded me that no matter how far we've gone down the wrong path, we always have the power to choose differently, to heal, and to become a better version of ourselves. The impact of the series wasn't confined to the pages of a book or the hours spent listening to it. It had fundamentally changed the way I approached life. It had taught me to question everything, to embrace discomfort, to forgive myself, and to lead with integrity. And perhaps most importantly, the vampire system had given me the courage to question the systems that define me, and to actively work to reshape them, to better align with the person I wanted to become. The journey wasn't over. Raylan's story may have ended, but mine was just beginning. As I reached the final part of the vampire system, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The story had come full circle, and Raylan, after so many trials, had ultimately found peace, not by escaping the systems around him, but by embracing them, understanding them, and choosing how to navigate them in a way that aligned with his personal truth. His journey was a powerful reminder that the systems we live within are not inherently bad or good. It is how we choose to relate to them that defines our lives. For me, the final chapters signified something else entirely, a beginning. Until this point, I had seen myself as someone stuck within systems, waiting for change to come from the outside. The book had completely redefined that perspective. Raylan's ability to confront his own internal battles, challenge external expectations, and ultimately reshape the world around him reminded me that I could do the same. The change I sought didn't need to come from anyone else but myself. As the story concluded, I found myself reflecting on what the future would look like for me. The lessons from the series were not just theoretical, they were real, applicable, and transformative. The vampire system had given me the tools to reclaim my agency in ways I had never considered before. I no longer saw the world as something I had to fight against, but as something I had the power to navigate consciously. One of the most powerful realizations I had was that the external systems we face, whether they are societal pressures, career constraints, or personal challenges, are not obstacles to be defeated. They are part of the greater journey of self-discovery. Raylan didn't just fight for his survival. He fought for the freedom to define his own life, to align himself with his values, and to create something meaningful for himself and those he loved. It wasn't about overthrowing the system. It was about creating a space within it that was uniquely his. This insight felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The systems I had been trying to escape weren't inherently evil. They were part of the complex, interconnected web of life, and it was up to me to choose how I engaged with them. It wasn't about achieving perfection or gaining total control. It was about becoming aware of my choices, owning my path, and embracing the responsibility that came with each decision I made. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Change never is. There would be moments when I would feel lost, when I would question my ability to navigate the systems that seemed so overwhelming. But now I knew that the power didn't lie in fighting against those systems. It lay in understanding them, accepting them, and choosing how to move through them with authenticity. The other lesson that stuck with me, perhaps the most important, was that growth is ongoing. The journey Raylan undertook from the very beginning was one of constant evolution. Character who started as an outsider, uncertain of his place in the world, was not the same character who emerged victorious at the end of the series. Raylan's evolution mirrored my own, an ongoing process of learning, unlearning, and becoming. There would never be a definitive endpoint. There would only be moments of realization, growth, and transformation. The goal wasn't to arrive, but to continuously move forward, embracing change as a necessary and valuable part of the human experience. And so, as I closed the final chapter, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the series, not just for its entertainment, but for the profound shift in perspective it had brought into my life. I no longer felt trapped by the systems I had once resented. I felt empowered to take control of how I navigated them, how I shaped my path, and how I contributed to the world around me. The journey Raylan had taken wasn't just a fantastical tale of vampires and power struggles. It was a reflection of the human condition, of the very challenges we all face in our lives. The themes of identity, sacrifice, power, love, and freedom were not just for the fictional world of vampires, they were universal. We all struggle with these questions. We all battle with who we are, what we stand for, and how we fit into the larger systems around us. In the end, I learned that I could no longer view myself as just a passive observer in the systems of my life. I was an active participant, and my choices mattered. Power I had wasn't in trying to escape or overthrow the system, it was in navigating it with purpose, awareness, and authenticity. Raylan had shown me that true freedom doesn't come from fighting the world around us. Comes from understanding it, embracing it, and ultimately using it to create a path that's uniquely our own. The future is unwritten, and the journey is far from over. But as I move forward, I know I am no longer defined by the systems I once thought controlled me. I am defined by my ability to choose, to grow, and to shape my path as I go.